The father who birthed his own granddaughter, the bloodline lost in its own curse of Appalachia. This is not a tale of folklore or mountain legend. This is the documented reality of the Harlow family, whose genetic tragedy unfolded in the isolated mountains of eastern Kentucky during the harsh winter of 1961, when a secret so grotesque emerged from the cold darkened hills that it would forever change how we understand the devastating consequences of families who refuse to let new blood enter their veins. Deep within the Appalachian Mountains, where fog clings to the hollows like unwanted memories and communities exist miles from the nearest paved road, the Harlow family had lived for 6 generations in complete isolation. Their settlement, known simply as Harlow, sat nestled between 2 steep mountain ridges in Pike County, Kentucky, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that became impassable during winter months. The nearest town, Pikeville, lay 17 miles away, but for the Harlows, it might as well have been on another continent. The patriarch of this cursed lineage was Jacob Harlow, born in 1919 to parents who were themselves first cousins. By 1961, Jacob was 42 years old, a coal miner with hands blackened permanently by the dust that had also settled deep in his lungs. His face bore the distinctive features that would become tragically common in his family. Eyes set unusually close together, a protruding lower jaw that made speech difficult, and ears positioned lower on his skull than normal anatomy would dictate. But in Harlow, where nearly everyone shared similar traits, Jacob appeared unremarkable. Jacob had married his own first cousin, Mary Beth Harlow, in 1938, when she was only 15 and he was 19. Their union was not considered unusual in the Hollow, where the family tree had long ago stopped branching and instead twisted back upon itself like a snake consuming its own tail. The Harlows believed in keeping their land, their traditions, and their blood within the family. Outsiders were viewed with deep suspicion, their presence barely tolerated during the rare occasions when supply traders ventured into the Hollow. Mary Beth bore Jacob 7 children between 1939 and 1952. 3 died before their first birthday, victims of complications that the traveling doctor who occasionally visited attributed to congenital deficiencies. The 4 who survived childhood each carried visible markers of their compromised genetics. Samuel, the eldest, had a cleft palate so severe that feeding him as an infant nearly proved impossible. Rebecca was born with 6 fingers on each hand and feet that turned inward so dramatically she could barely walk. Thomas arrived deaf with eyes of 2 different colors and a heart murmur that left him gasping after any physical exertion. And then there was Sarah. Sarah Harlow entered the world on a frozen February morning in 1944, during a snowstorm so severe that no doctor could reach the Hollow. Mary Beth labored for nearly 2 days before finally delivering a girl who appeared at first glance relatively healthy. Sarah cried with strong lungs, fed without difficulty, and seemed to be the one child the family's cursed bloodline had spared. As she grew, however, subtle signs of her genetic heritage became apparent: mild intellectual delays, facial asymmetry, and an unusual gait. But compared to her siblings, Sarah seemed almost blessed. The culture of Harlow in the 1950s was one of complete self-sufficiency born from geographical isolation and deliberate choice. The family operated a small farm, barely scratching survival from the Rocky Mountain soil. They spoke an archaic dialect of English, preserved from their Scottish-Irish ancestors who had settled the region in the 1790s, making communication with outsiders difficult even when they chose to attempt it. Their religious practices blended fundamentalist Christianity with older beliefs, creating a worldview that saw the outside world as inherently corrupt and dangerous. Education in the Hollow was minimal. Children learned to read from the family Bible and to write their names, but formal schooling was considered unnecessary and potentially corrupting. The family's isolation meant they lived in a time capsule, largely unaware of the rapidly changing American society beyond their mountains. In Harlow, it remained 1850, even as the calendar turned to 1960. Jacob Harlow exercised absolute authority over his household, as his father had before him and his grandfather before that. His word was law, enforced by religious conviction and physical intimidation. He interpreted scripture to support his belief that the family's isolation protected them from the sins of the modern world. He preached that outsider blood would dilute the family's spiritual purity, conveniently ignoring or perhaps not understanding the biological catastrophe his beliefs perpetuated. By 1958, Sarah had reached 14 years old. She worked alongside her mother and sister, tending the garden, preserving food for winter, and maintaining the 3-room cabin that housed the entire family. Her mental development had plateaued around a 3rd grade level, but she understood her responsibilities and performed them adequately. She possessed a gentle nature and found joy in small things: the first spring flowers, the taste of honey, the warmth of the wood stove on bitter winter nights. It was in the autumn of 1958 that the true horror of the Harlow bloodline began to manifest in its most grotesque form. Jacob, whose wife Mary Beth had become increasingly ill with what was likely undiagnosed cervical cancer, began to view his own daughter Sarah through eyes that held something far darker than paternal affection. In the isolated hollow where family roles had blurred across generations and normal social boundaries had eroded like the mountain soil, the unthinkable became thinkable and then became reality. The exact date when Jacob first violated the fundamental boundaries between father and daughter remains unknown, lost to time and the deliberate silence that shrouded Harlow Hollow. What is documented, however, is that by the spring of 1959, 15-year-old Sarah was pregnant, her belly swelling with a child that carried her father's DNA from two directions, as both grandfather and biological father. Confira sagea inscrito nescanal, because the truth hidden in these mountains will force you to confront the darkest capabilities of human isolation, and once you understand the real cost of closed bloodlines, you'll never view family the same way again. Mary Beth Harlow died in November 1959, her body finally surrendering to the disease that had ravaged her for months. The family buried her in the small cemetery on the hillside where 6 generations of Harlows lay beneath rough stone markers. Her death left Jacob as the sole authority in the household, and 17-year-old Samuel, who had married his own second cousin the previous year and moved to a nearby cabin, as the only other adult male in the immediate family. Sarah's pregnancy progressed through the bitter winter of 1959-1960. At 15, her body was barely prepared for childbearing, and the genetic catastrophe growing within her womb compounded the danger exponentially. The child developing inside her carried chromosomes that had been recycled through the Harlow family for generations, with Jacob's genetic contribution coming from both sides, a biological impossibility that nature never intended, creating a genetic echo chamber where recessive traits had nowhere to hide. The family spoke little of Sarah's condition. In Harlow Hollow, pregnancies were private matters, and questions about paternity were never asked. The assumption among the other family members was that Sarah had perhaps been involved with a young man from a neighboring hollow, though such interactions were rare and discouraged. Rebecca, Sarah's older sister, cared for her as her body struggled with the pregnancy, noting with growing concern how Sarah's already fragile health deteriorated as the months passed. On a sweltering August afternoon in 1960, Sarah went into labor. The temperature inside the cabin climbed above 95 degrees and flies buzzed against the grimy windows. Rebecca boiled water and prepared cloths, having assisted with births before, though she possessed no formal medical knowledge. Jacob remained outside, working in the garden, deliberately absent from the women's domain of childbirth. The labor lasted 16 hours. Sarah, weakened by malnutrition and the enormous strain on her underdeveloped body, screamed until her voice gave out, then whimpered like a wounded animal. Rebecca did what she could, but she quickly realized this birth was different from others she had witnessed. The baby was positioned wrong, and Sarah's pelvis, narrowed by her own genetic deficiencies, could barely accommodate the infant's passage. As darkness fell and Sarah's bleeding increased, Rebecca finally called for Jacob. They needed help, real medical help, from Pikeville. But Jacob refused to leave the hollow or to allow outsiders to enter. He believed that God's will would prevail, and if the child or mother died, it was simply meant to be. His religious convictions, twisted by generations of isolation, prevented him from seeking the intervention that might have saved both lives. Near midnight, after hours of agonized pushing, the baby finally emerged. She was a girl, tiny and wrinkled, with skin that appeared almost translucent. She drew breath and cried weakly, and for a moment Rebecca felt a surge of relief. But as she cleaned the infant and examined her by lamplight, the full horror of the child's condition became apparent. The baby, whom Sarah named Emma with her last conscious words before slipping into exhaustion, bore physical abnormalities so severe that she appeared almost inhuman. Her skull was misshapen, elongated in the back, and flattened on one side. Her eyes, a cloudy blue-gray, were set so far apart that she looked like two different profiles merged incorrectly. Her mouth extended too far to one side, giving her face a grotesque asymmetry. Her limbs were thin and twisted, with fingers that lacked proper joints and feet that curled inward completely. But the most disturbing aspect of Emma's appearance was her skin. In places it seemed stretched too thin, revealing the blue network of veins beneath. In other areas, particularly around her joints, excess skin folded and bunched, creating wrinkles inappropriate for an infant. Her ears were malformed, one significantly smaller than the other, positioned at different heights on her small skull. Rebecca wrapped the baby in a clean cloth, her hands trembling. She had seen children born with defects before. The Harlow had produced many such unfortunate souls, but never anything like this. This child looked like a cruel joke of nature, a living demonstration of what happens when the same genetic code is folded back upon itself too many times. Sarah, hemorrhaging and feverish, lived for 3 more days. She died on August 13, 1960, just 16 years old, having given birth to her own half-sister who was also her daughter. Rebecca prepared her body for burial, washing away the blood and dressing her in the only good dress she owned. They buried Sarah next to her mother in the family cemetery, and Jacob read a few verses from the Bible over her grave. He showed no emotion, no acknowledgement of his role in her death, no recognition that he had destroyed his own daughter and birthed a child that should never have existed. Emma survived, though survival might not have been the kindest outcome. In those first months she barely grew, taking milk poorly and crying with a strange gurgling sound that suggested problems with her throat and nasal passages. She could not lift her own head until she was nearly 6 months old, and when she did, it wobbled unsteadily, as if her neck lacked the strength or structure to support it properly. The years between 1960 and 1968 saw Emma Harlow grow in body. Though development would be a generous term for the changes she underwent, Rebecca, now the primary woman in Jacob's household, took responsibility for the child's care, a burden made heavier by Emma's extensive needs and her own conflicted feelings about the girl's origins. By age 3, Emma could not walk. Her twisted legs and malformed hips made standing impossible without support. She pulled herself across the rough wooden floors using her arms, which were slightly more functional than her lower limbs, leaving her hands and knees scraped and bleeding. She made sounds but could not form words, her palate and tongue not properly configured for speech. Her mental development appeared frozen at an infantile level, though whether this was due to cognitive deficits or her complete lack of sensory stimulation remained unclear. The child's face became more disturbing as she aged. The asymmetry grew more pronounced, with one side of her face seeming to slide downward, giving her a permanently sorrowful expression. Her teeth, when they finally emerged, came in randomly, some pointing forward, others sideways, creating a mouth that could not fully close. Drool constantly leaked from the corner of her lips, soaking her clothes and creating sores on her chin. Emma's eyes, perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of her appearance, held a distant quality, as if she existed somewhere between consciousness and absence. They rarely focused on anything specific, wandering independently in their sockets. Medical professionals who would later examine Cord speculated that she was likely blind or at least severely visually impaired, her optic nerves damaged by the genetic catastrophe that created her. Jacob regarded Emma with a mixture of indifference and disgust. She represented his sin-made flesh, a walking testament to his violations, though he would never articulate or perhaps even fully acknowledge this reality. He provided basic necessities, food, shelter, warmth, but gave no affection. No attention beyond ensuring she did not die under his roof. To him, she was simply another mouth to feed in a household already struggling with poverty. Rebecca, however, developed a complex relationship with her niece half-sister. She felt simultaneously repulsed by Emma's appearance and overwhelmed with pity for this innocent child who had committed no sin but bore all the punishment. She bathed Emma daily, an exhausting process given the girl's inability to support herself. She fed her by hand, patiently spooning thin porridge into that malformed mouth, wiping away what dribbled out, trying again. She rocked her when she cried. Those terrible gurgling cries that spoke of pain Rebecca could neither understand nor alleviate. The Harlow existed in its own temporal bubble, but even in isolation, time moved forward. By 1965, the wider American society was experiencing dramatic changes: the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, the beginnings of social revolution. None of this penetrated Harlow. Life continued as it had for generations. Subsistence farming, coal mining for the men, domestic labor for the women, and an insularity that protected them from outside influence while simultaneously ensuring their genetic doom. In 1966, when Emma was 6 years old, a traveling preacher named Reverend Thomas McKnight ventured into the Harlow. McKnight, a Baptist minister from Pikeville, made it his mission to visit the most remote communities in Pike County, bringing spiritual guidance and occasionally practical assistance. His arrival at the Harlow cabin in September 1966 marked the first time an outsider had been inside their home in over a decade. What McKnight witnessed shocked him to his core. He found a family living in conditions he described in his journal as more primitive than the pioneer days, but more disturbing. Was the child he discovered lying on a blanket in the corner of the main room. Emma, now 6 years old but the size of a malnourished 3-year-old, represented a level of human suffering McKnight had never encountered. He spent 3 hours at the Harlow cabin speaking with Jacob and Rebecca, carefully observing while trying not to show his horror. Jacob explained that Emma was his granddaughter, born to his daughter Sarah, who had died in childbirth. He said nothing about being her biological father, and the preacher, not yet suspecting the full truth, accepted this explanation. However, McKnight recognized that the child needed medical attention far beyond what the family could provide. At this critical moment in the story, I want you to consider the weight of the secret this family carried, and comment below the words that Rebecca whispered to herself every night as she cared for Emma. Forgive me for what I cannot change. If those words resonate with you, if you feel the crushing burden of impossible situations, share them in the comments so others can understand the human cost of silence in the face of horror. McKnight returned to Pikeville and immediately contacted the county health department. He described the conditions in Harlow and specifically mentioned the severely disabled child who appeared to be receiving inadequate care. This set in motion a series of events that would finally pierce the veil of secrecy that had protected the Harlow family's genetic nightmare for generations. The Pike County Health Department, operating with limited resources and staff in 1966, took 3 months to organize a visit to Harlow. On a cold December morning, 2 health workers, a nurse named Patricia Coleman and a social services representative named Douglas Fraser, made the difficult journey up the mountain path to the Harlow settlement. Jacob initially refused them entry, standing in his doorway with arms crossed, his face set in hostile lines. He declared that outsiders had no business interfering in family matters and that the government had no authority in his home. It was only when Fraser explained that they could return with law enforcement and potentially remove the child by force that Jacob reluctantly stepped aside and allowed them to enter. What Coleman and Fraser documented that day would eventually become part of official county records, though those files remained sealed until 1987. Coleman's nursing notes described Emma in clinical terms that barely concealed her shock. Female child, approximately 6 years of age, presenting with severe developmental delays, multiple skeletal abnormalities, facial deformities, consistent with severe genetic disorders, nonverbal, non-ambulatory, appears to lack basic cognitive function, living conditions grossly inadequate, suspect severe neglect and possible genetic abnormalities consistent with familial consanguinity. The term familial consanguinity was as close as Coleman could come in 1966 to naming what she suspected, that this child was the product of incestuous relations. But proving such a thing without modern genetic testing was nearly impossible, and accusing a family patriarch of such a crime in rural Kentucky, where family privacy was sacred and outsiders were deeply distrusted, required more evidence than physical appearance alone. Fraser interviewed Rebecca at length while Coleman examined Emma. Rebecca, worn down by years of isolation and the burden of caring for both her brother-in-law's household and his severely disabled daughter-niece, began to crack under the social worker's gentle but persistent questioning. She revealed that Sarah, Emma's mother, had been only 15 when she gave birth. She admitted that no man from outside the family had been courting Sarah. She confessed that after Mary Beth's death, Jacob had become different towards Sarah, though she struggled to articulate exactly what she meant by this. The health workers left Harlow that day with enough concerns to file a formal report with both the health department and the county sheriff's office. However, in 1966 rural Kentucky, the wheels of justice turned slowly, especially when allegations involved powerful dynamics of family structure and remote communities that preferred handling their own affairs. It was Emma herself who provided the catalyst for action. In March 1967, now 7 years old, she developed a severe respiratory infection. Her compromised immune system, weakened further by malnutrition and her genetic deficiencies, could not fight the illness. Rebecca begged Jacob to allow her to take Emma to a doctor in Pikeville, but he refused, insisting that the child would recover on her own, or that it was simply her time to die. Rebecca, facing a moral crisis that would define her character, made a decision that would shatter the family's isolation forever. In the middle of the night, she bundled Emma in blankets, carried her slight body down the mountain path in darkness, and walked 17 miles to Pikeville. She arrived at the county hospital as dawn broke, collapsing in the emergency entrance with Emma limp and barely breathing in her arms. The doctors at the small rural hospital stabilized Emma's breathing and treated her pneumonia with antibiotics. But they quickly realized that her medical needs extended far beyond a respiratory infection. They documented her physical abnormalities in detail, took photographs from medical records, and contacted specialists at the University of Kentucky Medical Center in Lexington, 4 hours away. Dr. Robert Caldwell, a geneticist who made the trip to Pikeville to examine Emma, spent 2 days conducting tests and observations. His preliminary report, dated April 3, 1967, concluded, "This child presents with physical and cognitive abnormalities consistent with severe genetic disorders resulting from close consanguineous relations, likely parent-child or sibling relations repeated across multiple generations. The severity of malformations suggests multi-generational inbreeding. Recommend immediate investigation into family structure and removal of child from home environment if parental relations are confirmed." Dr. Caldwell's report triggered a formal investigation by Kentucky Child Protective Services, working in conjunction with the Pike County Sheriff's Department. In May 1967, officers returned to Harlow with a court order allowing them to question family members and examine genealogical records, if any existed. What they discovered exceeded their darkest suspicions. The family Bible, which Rebecca provided, contained 6 generations of marriages between cousins, uncles, and nieces, and in one documented case, a grandfather and granddaughter. The tree didn't branch, it spiraled inward, each generation drawing from an ever-shrinking gene pool. Under pressure and facing potential criminal charges, Jacob Harlow finally confessed in June 1967 to fathering Emma with his own daughter Sarah. The confession was delivered in flat, emotionless terms, as if he were describing planting a field or slaughtering a pig. He showed no remorse, no understanding of the magnitude of his crimes. In his worldview, shaped by generations of isolation and the complete erosion of normal social boundaries, he had simply done what Harlow men had always done, kept the bloodline pure. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by numerous factors. In 1967, Kentucky law regarding incestuous relations was clear, but proving paternity without genetic testing required medical evidence and witness testimony. Sarah was dead, unable to testify. Emma's physical condition provided circumstantial evidence, but medical experts acknowledged that genetic testing technology of the era could not definitively prove Jacob was her biological father rather than grandfather. Ultimately, prosecutors built their case on medical evidence, Rebecca's testimony, and Jacob's own confession. In October 1967, Jacob Harlow was arrested and charged with multiple counts including felony incest, contributing to the delinquency of a minor, and involuntary manslaughter in Sarah's death. The trial, held in March 1968, drew national attention, with reporters from major newspapers traveling to Pikeville to cover what they termed the Appalachian horror. The trial revealed the full extent of the Harlow family's genetic catastrophe. Medical experts testified about the effects of repeated inbreeding, explaining to the jury how recessive genetic traits become dominant when the gene pool becomes too small. They presented charts showing how chromosomes double back on themselves in incestuous reproduction, creating a genetic echo that amplifies every weakness and deficiency. Emma was never brought to the courtroom. Her condition would not allow it, but photographs were admitted as evidence. The jury, composed of local residents familiar with rural poverty but shocked by the extremity of this case, deliberated for only 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Jacob Harlow was sentenced to 30 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary. He served 19 years before dying of lung cancer in 1987, his lungs finally destroyed by the coal dust that had been slowly killing him since adolescence. He never expressed remorse for his actions and, according to prison records, refused all visits from family members, spending his remaining years in isolation by choice. Emma Harlow was placed in the care of Kentucky's State Facility for Severely Disabled Individuals, an institution in Frankfort that provided round-the-clock medical supervision. She lived there for 23 years, never developing beyond the cognitive level of a 6-month-old infant. She died in March 1990, 3 months before her 30th birthday, from complications related to her multiple genetic disorders. The death certificate listed the cause as respiratory failure, but the underlying cause was written simply as congenital malformations secondary to consanguinity. Rebecca Harlow testified at her brother-in-law's trial, her testimony providing crucial details about the family's isolated existence in Sarah's final days. Following the trial, she left Harlow forever, moving to Lexington, where she found work as a cleaning woman in an office building. She never married, never had children of her own, and rarely spoke about her years in the Hollow. She died in 2003 at age 76. taking with her countless memories of a life lived in isolation and the terrible burden of secrets she carried for too long. The Harlow settlement itself was gradually abandoned following Jacob's arrest. Samuel Harlow and his wife moved to West Virginia seeking coal mining work. Other family members dispersed across eastern Kentucky seeking to escape the stigma attached to the Harlow name. By 1975, the cabin stood empty, slowly returning to the mountain as nature reclaimed the land. The case of Emma Harlow and the broader tragedy of the Harlow family bloodline stands as one of the most extensively documented examples of multi-generational consanguinity in American history. Medical researchers from the University of Kentucky studied the family's genealogical records and medical histories, publishing findings in academic journals throughout the 1970s and 1980s. These studies contributed significantly to our understanding of how genetic isolation affects human populations over multiple generations. The Harlow case revealed that the effects of closed bloodlines extend far beyond individual health problems, and the family's isolation created a closed social system where normal taboos eroded, where religious beliefs were twisted to justify the unjustifiable, and where poverty and geographical remoteness combined to trap people in cycles of tragedy that repeated across generations. Modern genetic science has confirmed what observers in 1967 could only suspect. Emma's genetic code was so compromised by the doubling of her father-grandfather's contribution that approximately 30% of her genome was homozygous, meaning she inherited identical copies of genes from both parents because those parents were so closely related. This level of genetic homozygosity is incompatible with normal human development and explains the severity of her physical and cognitive disabilities. The Harlow tragedy also exposed how isolation, whether geographical, social, or cultural, can create conditions where the unthinkable becomes normalized. For generations, the family lived in a bubble where their practices seemed normal because everyone around them participated in the same patterns. It was only when that bubble was pierced by outside intervention that the full horror of their situation became apparent to the family members themselves. If you've watched this entire investigation into the darkest corners of genetic isolation and human tragedy, you understand now why these stories must be told. Confirase Jaya inscrito nes canal, because knowledge of our darkest chapters is the only protection against repeating them. If you've made it to the end of Emma Harlow's story, leave a comment saying I watched until the end, so I can know who truly values understanding these difficult truths. Hit the like button if this story made you think differently about the importance of genetic diversity and social connection. And share this video with someone who needs to understand that isolation, whether chosen or imposed, carries devastating consequences that echo across generations. The hollow where the Harlows lived remains empty today, accessible only to hikers willing to venture deep into the Kentucky mountains. Occasionally, someone stumbles upon the remains of the old cabins or discovers the small cemetery where Sarah, Mary Beth, and other Harlows lie beneath weathered stones. These ruins stand as silent monuments to a family whose bloodline turned back upon itself so many times that it finally consumed itself entirely. Curse written not in supernatural forces but in the cold mathematics of genetic science and the terrible human capacity for self-destruction through isolation.